on behalf of the faculty, I'm just very glad to welcome everybody here tonight to our open forum. I'd like to start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners, the traditional custodians of the land on which this wonderful building is constructed, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. We also in the faculty try to do that kind of thing more than just in saying that kind of rather formulaic statement. The commitment of the law school since we started 40 years ago next year has been really strong in the areas of Indigenous legal education, research and community service. And if you look in your takeaway bag that you've got on your seat, you'll see, particularly I draw attention to the red brochure, which gives a survey of the work that we're doing in Indigenous legal education, of which the faculty is particularly proud. We're particularly proud also of the work of the two other parts. Community service, I particularly pay tribute to the work being done through Kingsford Legal Centre, particularly its work in outreach to the Indigenous communities of the eastern suburbs out to La Perouse. And finally, and particularly to the work of the Indigenous Law Centre, the organiser of tonight's forum. And we're very, very lucky in the faculty to have such wonderful people associated with the Indigenous Law Centre, particularly Megan Davis sitting here, and the coordinator of the centre, Jeanette Murdoch, who I'll pass you over to now. So thanks again, Jeanette.
Well, thank you everyone, and I'm so glad you could all make it this evening. I know it was a bit of a rush to be here at 6 p.m. from work and other places. I won't sort of speak anymore. I'd like to hand over the mic, because I'm very uncomfortable with the mic, to Megan Davis, our Director of the Indigenous Law Centre. It's an absolute privilege to have Megan as our Director. She brings so much wealth and knowledge and support to all of us. Megan was recently, I'm sure you would all be aware, elected to the United Nations Permanent Forum of Indigenous Peoples. She'll actually take up I suppose you can call it the post next year, and she'll hold that for 3 years. And it's just, it was an amazing sort of tribute to obviously Megan, her family and colleagues, but to us at the centre. So hopefully the evening you'll find interesting. There'll be some comments that'll come out from the group, and I really look forward to the engagement between the panel members and the people here this evening. So enjoy yourself. And one quick point I just wanted to mention, after we have the open forum, there's some nibbles and drinks upstairs, which I'd really encourage you all to come along, because that enables you to chat in a much more informal way and just sort of network amongst the people that have come along tonight. So I'll pass over the mic to Megan. Thank you.
I'm going to stand back here, take advantage of the lectern. Thank you, Jeanette. And as a Cobble Aboriginal woman, I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on today. Welcome everybody to the Indigenous Law Centre's Open Forum on Racism and Sport. The Indigenous Law Centre Open Forums are run by Indigenous Law Centre student volunteers and interns, and they've been incredibly popular, providing important and thought-provoking insights into Indigenous legal issues. So over the past year, we've discussed and debated alcohol restrictions and the recognition of Aboriginal customary law, and tonight we turn to the issue of racism in sport. 2010 started out as a very good year for rugby league, especially with the incredibly exciting and successful All-Stars concept which the NRL launched this year. So the Indigenous All-Stars playing the NRL All-Stars, which many of us attended at Skill Park on the Gold Coast earlier this year. Moreover, the NRL has launched its second Reconciliation Action Plan. And so it was disappointing then when during the second State of Origin, Timana Tahu walked out on the New South Wales camp in protest of a racially discriminatory slur made against Graeme Innes by Andrew Johns. As a human rights lawyer, as an Aboriginal woman, but also as a lifelong rugby league fan, I was disappointed by the behaviour of Andrew Johns. So how does this behaviour sit with the NRL's anti-vilification policy, which has been approved by the Australian Human Rights Commission as part of its rules and code of conduct, and which was recently reviewed by the Australian Human Rights Commission. And what type of education do players undergo in regards to player rights as well as cultural awareness? And rugby league aside, how does racism in sport reflect mainstream attitudes about Indigenous peoples and institutional racism in general? And what are the possibilities and limitations of sport in bringing about social change? These are some of the questions that we had hoped to explore tonight in the open forum. So we have invited a cross-section of commentators and experts on sport and law from a number of sporting codes, including rugby league, AFL and netball. And we've also invited the Australian Human Rights Commission's Race Discrimination Commissioner, Graeme Innes. While we know that sport can be influential in the public's attitude towards race, we must keep in mind that there are other more significant institutions whose role it is to take the lead on combating racism, including governments, education and human rights institutions. And we certainly hope that Graeme can speak to that. So to begin tonight, first I will introduce each of our very distinguished panellists, and then I'll ask each panellist to speak for roughly 5 to 10 minutes about the issue, and then we'll take questions from the floor. So to begin with the panel members' profiles. First of all, we're very privileged to have David Gallop come tonight. We know it's been an extremely busy week for him. He's had the captain's call and the Dally M and State of the Game report and the ILC open forum. So thank you, David, for making time in this very busy week. So David has been Chief Executive Officer of the National Rugby League since 2002. In 2010, he was also named Chairman of the Australian Sports Commission after having been appointed to the board in 2008. Gallop has also been the Secretary of the Rugby League International Federation since its inception in 1998. David holds a Bachelor of Arts from the Australian National University and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Sydney. After working as a solicitor at Holman Webb, he became General Counsel for Super League at News Limited from 1995 to 1997. Next, I'd like to introduce Graeme Innes. Graeme was appointed Australia's Disability Discrimination Commissioner and Race Discrimination Commissioner in July 2009, after holding the role of Human Rights Commissioner and Disability Discrimination Commissioner since 2005. In these roles, he has contributed to initiatives aimed to reduce discrimination in many areas of the law. Graeme has been a human rights practitioner for almost 30 years in New South Wales, Western Australia and nationally. He has also been a member of the New South Wales Administrative Decisions Tribunal, the New South Wales Consumer, Trader and Tenancy Tribunal and the Social Security Appeals Tribunal, as well as a hearing commissioner with the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Barry Judd. Barry holds a Bachelor of Arts from Ballarat University College, a graduate diploma of Public Policy and Master of Arts from the University of Melbourne, as well as a graduate certificate of higher education and a PhD from Monash. He was recently awarded an ARC Indigenous Postdoctoral Research Fellowship. Barry is a descendant of the Pitjantjatjara people of northwest South Australia, and his PhD thesis explored cross-cultural engagements between Aboriginal people and Anglo-Australians in the sport of AFL. He continues to research this topic, enabling him to further develop his interest in Aboriginal affairs policy and administration. Our next panellist is Deborah Healy. Deborah holds a Bachelor of Law and Masters of Law from the University of Sydney. She joined the faculty at UNSW in 2003 after practicing as a commercial lawyer with a focus of competition law with an interest in sport and the law. She is the convener of the corporate and commercial stream of the LLM program. Deb is also a consultant author of CCH Trade Practices Reporter. Deb's a member of the Asian Competition and Economic Law Centre of Hong Kong. She's a member of the Commonwealth Consumer Affairs Advisory Council, editor of the Australian and New Zealand Sports Law Journal and chair of the Management Committee of the Indigenous Law Centre. And finally, I'd like to welcome Marcia Ella-Duncan. Marcia is a descendant of the Yuin Nation on the New South Wales far south coast. Marcia chaired the New South Wales Aboriginal Child Sexual Assault Task Force, which reported to the New South Wales Government in 2006, and is a member of the New South Wales Aboriginal Child Sexual Assault Ministerial Advisory Panel. She was also a member of the Northern Territory Emergency Response Review Board. Marcia has worked in policy and legislation development and was elected chairperson of ATSIC for the Sydney region. But most importantly, Marcia is a former Australian netballer, was the first Aboriginal Australian scholarship recipient at the Australian Institute of Sport, and the first Aboriginal woman to represent Australia in netball. For her sporting achievements, she has been recognised with an Order of Australia Medal for services to netball. So would everybody welcome our distinguished panel? So I think we'll just go in order of introduction. So we'll begin with David Gallop.
Thanks very much, Megan, and can I add my thanks to David and Jeanette, and I think Deb was the first person that contacted me about coming along tonight. It's great to be back at University of New South Wales, although as you heard I'm not a graduate of this law faculty. I did spend the best part of 10 years trundling away mainly at the southern end of the village green there. I think I probably bowled literally thousands of overs of cricket balls down there from about the mid-80s to the mid-90s, so I am familiar with the University of New South Wales, at least in that respect. Can I add my acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight, and kick off with some preliminary comments. The concept of racism in sport is an interesting one for sports fans and the general community. With very few exceptions that I can think of, sport is in fact something that presents a universal challenge to racism. Whether it be Jesse Owens at the 1936 Olympics, the Black Power salutes of Mexico City, or even the isolation of South Africa from the sporting stage, racist attitudes have often been challenged through sport more easily than anywhere else. Sport, in fact, provides an environment that overtakes many of the social barriers that may exist away from the sporting arena. It's a place where movie stars like Russell Crowe, business leaders and battlers from the suburbs come along with their families and share the same outcomes, the same hopes and the same disappointments. I would like to think that rugby league is a great leveller. It brings together a diverse range of cultures and in particular has always been a showcase for Indigenous athletes in this country. As Megan mentioned, earlier this year at Skort Park on the Gold Coast, we pioneered an all-stars concept that we believe was unlike any event elsewhere in the world. Smiley Johnston, who chairs our ARL Indigenous Council, described the All-Stars as the greatest act of practical reconciliation he had ever seen. An African-American sports administrator named Kevin Griffin from the Seattle Seahawks NFL team, who we had done a little work with recently, had an entirely different reaction when we told him about the concept. He said something to the effect of, "You intend to play a team of blacks against a team of whites? There's no way we could do that in America." I actually don't think any other sport could have broken that ground in quite the same way, a way that celebrated the contribution of Indigenous athletes in our game, that brought together people from a range of cultures and that not only highlighted the issues many Indigenous Australians face, but which launched programs to address those issues. The Department of Employment, Education and Welfare's Learn, Earn, Legend campaign was launched through the All-Stars and is one of the many lasting legacies from the match. As we heard before, did any of that prevent rugby league from being the centre of headlines over racist comments that offended Timana Tahu later in the year? No. In fact, the fact is that racial issues can come to light in many environments and often through carelessness and ignorance as much as deliberate malice. The effect for individuals and communities who are on the receiving end can be equally hurtful no matter what the intent. That is why we all need to look at the issue of racism as one we need to actively work to address rather than passively assume it to be someone else's problem. It isn't just sport's problem, but sport can be one of the biggest weapons in the fight against it. We believe promotions such as our All-Stars match, Close the Gap round and Harmony Days play important roles in promoting positive messages among the community, as does our game-wide commitment to reconciliation through our action plan through Reconciliation Australia. We have to accept that we will face issues from time to time and that we have to be clear in addressing them. At the same time, we also need to ensure we are promoting education in terms of cultural awareness, not only for Indigenous athletes, but for all in the community. Hopefully, in doing so, we can also provide some inspiration and direction for the rest of the community.
Thanks. Well, I also would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people and thanks to the organisers of today's forum for the opportunity to speak. I'm frequently asked to talk about racism in various contexts and about how to bring about changes that we need to make racism history. I don't have a universal blueprint for eradicating racism. I wish I did. But I know that we can't bring about change without a commitment to human rights education and strong leadership. And this applies to sport in Australia as much as to any other arena. Last year, the Commonwealth Government concluded the biggest national consultation process in Australian history. It found strong nationwide support for a Human Rights Act, and it also found low levels of human rights literacy. In fact, many people believed that their rights under the Constitution are protected by the Fifth Amendment. Sadly, that's the American Constitution. Now, what does this have to do with racism in sport, you might ask? Well, sport's a terrific arena to teach people about rights. Australians watch, play and engage in sport in large numbers. We follow the often dramatic lives of sports stars. We praise them as heroes and as role models, and we envy their salary packages. We revel in Australia as a sporting nation. Sport breaks down barriers in ways that other areas of society can struggle to match by encouraging participation, integration and diversity. And this is the fantasy of an egalitarian, sports-loving Australia. But the reality is very different. In 2007, the Commission published the What's the Score report, which explored the state of play in 17 sports, including the NRL. The report found that people from culturally and linguistically diverse or CALD backgrounds, and I'm sorry, I know this is the Indigenous Law Centre, but we need to recognise right from the start that racism is an issue that affects a lot more people in Australia than just Indigenous people, and I don't in any way minimise the impact that it has on Indigenous people, it certainly does, but there's a much broader range of people. But people from CALD backgrounds were underrepresented in the numbers participating in sporting organisations and competitions. CALD people did not participate in a wide range of sports. Barriers to their... sorry, just before I go on with that, let's actually have a look at some of the stats because when I pulled them out for this presentation, I think they're stark. People born in Australia, 68% of people born in Australia participate in sport and recreation. And from people born from non-English speaking backgrounds in other countries, it's 52%. For kids outside school, 64% of kids born in Australia participate in sport outside school. 40% of people born in countries where the first language is not English. For Indigenous participation of Indigenous people, 45% of Indigenous Australians participate in sport. 64% of other Australians participate. And out of the 322 Indigenous communities with a population of 50 or more people, 33% or a third have no sporting facilities. So let's look at participation by sport. In rugby league, 0.7% of people born in Australia participate in rugby league. 0.2% participate who are born in countries whose first language is not English. And in terms of attendance at sport, and I want to be clear that I'm not targeting specifically rugby league here, but let's just have a look at these figures. For Australian rules, 18.8% of people born in Australia attend, 5.8% of people born in CALD countries. For cricket, it's 5.2 and 2.4. For horse racing, it's 14.7 and 3.7. And for rugby league, it's 10.9 and 3.4. So the stats are stark, and we need to recognise that and face up to the problem. Barriers to access for people whose first language is not English include the fear of discrimination or racism. And for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, who again also are not represented proportionally in sporting organisations, although they may be to some extent at the national or elite level. So when we talk about Australia being a sporting nation, about sport as an equalising field that all Australians engage in, we're actually not talking about Indigenous and CAL people as Australians. When CAL and Indigenous people are denied access to sport, they're denied access to building social capital, to better health outcomes, to the benefits of community participation and cohesion. This is a human rights issue. When CAL and Indigenous Australians or players are subjected to racist abuse, bullying, violence and harassment, it's also a human rights issue. We know the impacts of racism, the shattered confidence, the opportunities curtailed, the lasting physical and psychological damage. These are real impacts. Since 2007, the Commission's worked with various sporting bodies to address these issues. My colleague, Commissioner Mick Gooder, recently mediated a good outcome for the NRL on the Timana Tahu Johns case. And the Commission has started meetings at the request of the NRL to assist with activities to address racism throughout the sport. Can I just clarify what Megan said, though, in your introduction? We haven't approved the NRL's vilification code because we can't approve such codes. We've certainly commented on it, and we are participating in its review, but that review hasn't been completed. But these meetings have emphasised the need for education across all levels of involvement, from players to coaches and to board members. Adequate processes for complaint handling, cultural awareness and education, and strategies to address crowd behaviour. Other examples of the Commission implementing policies against racism in sport include our funding for the playbytherules.net.au, which is a website dedicated to removal of discrimination in sport. Yet for every high-profile incident of racism in sport, and sadly there have been a few in the last 6 months, there are scores of stories of exclusion, inaccessibility and harassment and violence. The young woman who can't participate in a game or watch a game because of inappropriate dress codes. The young Indigenous boy who's a victim of racist jokes, and so on and so on. Challenging racism in sport is about sports people at all levels showing leadership, developing the policies that say this is unacceptable and implementing those policies. It means recognising that players and spectators and participants have the right to be free from racist violence, bullying and harassment, and actually doing something about it. Sporting bodies shouldn't wait for an official complaint to be made before they take action. Senior staff can intervene if they believe vilification has occurred. These rights are not only about conciliation and arbitration and the involvement of the Commission once the incidents have happened and the complaints have been made. They're also about what happens before this point. Sports bodies need transparent processes, good policies and codes of conduct to address the issue before it becomes a problem and to create a culture that rejects racism in the first place. This is the message that we need to get out to everybody involved in sport, from players to spectators to CEOs and to all levels of governance, to boards and to the media reporting it. Racism is violence, it's a human rights violation and it's unacceptable. This includes harassment, bullying, abuse and jokes. We need to continue with strong education about rights and racism. Challenging racism in sport also involves educating observers and bystanders to act when they witness or come across racist behaviour, as Timana Tahu did, and undoing the structural inequities that stop people from CALD and Indigenous backgrounds from benefiting in sport. Sport in Australia is a litmus test of multicultural and Indigenous issues, and incidents of racism on the field don't occur in a vacuum, but reflect and inform general community views and concerns and what's considered acceptable. Racist abuse and vilification in sport are not private issues between the players concerned. So when Timana Tahu resigns from the State of Origin game over racial vilification comments, the ensuing outcry shows the inconsistencies and conflicts in how people view racism in Australia. We know that sport plays an important role in creating social capital by developing connections, openness and respect between different individuals and groups. We also know that racism in sport can create division, obstruct participation and deny Indigenous and CAL people access to this capital. Racism in sport also creates an image of an Australia of monolithic whiteness that's hostile to diversity and fairness. Racism happens everywhere, all the time. Racism in sport is no exception. What we need to do is to continually challenge it with strong leadership, resources and proactive action. Thanks for the chance to speak tonight.
Thank you. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which I speak. Coming from an Indigenous Studies field, my little talk is of course not going to be directly linked to law, but more to racism in sport as an issue of culture and Australian culture. And coming from Melbourne, I'm also going to speak about the Australian Football League. During the past 2 decades, the Australian Football League has successfully positioned itself as the national sporting brand most closely associated with the process of reconciliation and the non-tolerance of racism in sport. The AFL was the first professional sporting body in Australia to combat on-field racism by adopting anti-vilification laws in 1995. At the same time, the AFL also became a strong public voice for reconciliation through events such as the annual Dreamtime at the G match, recognition of an Indigenous Team of the Century, and sometimes a tacit acknowledgement of Marn Grook as the precursor to the contemporary game. Coinciding with the political dominance of the Conservative Howard government, AFL advocacy of Indigenous issues arguably made it the most important national institution in promoting a contemporary Australia inclusive of Indigenous peoples, cultures, histories and identities. In this respect, the AFL assumed a de facto national leadership role in Indigenous affairs to the extent that it claimed expertise on issues concerning Indigenous Australia, including those of racism, reconciliation, education and employment. Validation of these claims has been proclaimed with widespread and repetitive media reference to the increase in the number of Indigenous players participating in the AFL competition since the 1980s. Indigenous people, while just 2.5% of the national population, accounted for 11% of all playing personnel in the 2010 season of the Australian Football League. These increases in the public visibility of Indigenous people playing the game have been used to portray the AFL as an institution that has moved beyond the paradigm of Australian racism. The AFL, according to narratives popularised in the mainstream media, has achieved reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people that positions Australian football as the undisputable national game. Well, that's how people in Melbourne see it. Although the many achievements of the AFL in promoting Indigenous Australia have been of national significance, I argue that work to make Australian football a game that can be truly shared by Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians alike remains unfinished business. Indeed, it is my contention that the work of the previous 2 decades to create opportunities for Indigenous players in Australian football at the elite level of competition that were not available to earlier generations of Indigenous footballers should not be seen as the endpoint of anti-racism and reconciliation work in the game, but rather an outcome of recent transformations in the specific forms of racism that are applied to Indigenous people in the context of the sporting discourses that operate in and around Australian football. My understanding that the rhetoric of anti-racism and reconciliation in fact constitutes new tropes of racism within Australian football is informed by my own decade-long interest in the relationship, past and present, between Indigenous Australians and Australian football. As an academic working in the field of Australian Indigenous Studies, I have been most interested in how discourses of Anglo-Australian nationalism have structured popular understanding of Australian football in ways that have for most part excluded Indigenous people and their cultural identities from participating and/or participating openly in the national game. These were issues I explored in my PhD thesis that was later published in the book On the Boundary Line, Colonial Identity in Football. In a number of articles published since, I have tracked how discourses of Anglo-Australian nationalism have morphed into narratives that represent Australian football as a sport that appears to openly embrace Indigenous participants and celebrate the long-standing contribution Indigenous people have made to our game. In a number of articles co-authored with Chris Hallinan, we conclude that the contemporary relationship between Indigenous people and Australian football can best be understood as shaped by forms of what we call enlightened racism. First used in a media study of sitcoms in the United States, where researchers found that the main black characters in The Cosby Show and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air were portrayed in ways that confirmed and reinforced white idealisations of contemporary American race relations. Applying the concept of enlightened racism, our conclusions suggest that racism in Australian football did not end with the adoption of anti-racism laws or AFL support of reconciliation. Rather, long-standing Anglo-Australian nationalist narratives about Indigenous Australians continue to inform the attitude that the Australian football fraternity hold towards Indigenous people. Defining Indigenous Australians according to the stereotypes handed down to them in the stories of former colonists, popular imagery of the Australian Aborigine as childlike, physical, savage or noble savage, intellectually lacking, Stone Age, out of time, exotic, hunter-gatherer, remain informative in the culture of Australian football. In a survey of recruiting staff at AFL clubs, we found the commonly held belief that Indigenous people bring a different skill set to the game because of racial and cultural attributes born out of 40,000 plus years of hunting and gathering, and we found that to be widespread. Lightning reflexes of hand and foot, super fast acceleration speeds, and a different sense of time and space are racial and cultural attributes that make Indigenous players a highly sought after commodity in contemporary Australian football. According to our reading of Australian football, old colonial stereotypes of race and culture that were once applied to exclude and marginalise are now the driving rationale behind the overrepresentation of Indigenous players in the AFL, and may be termed enlightened racism because they proclaim an idealised relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, whereby racism has been defeated and reconciliation achieved. Exposing the processes in which old-fashioned Anglo-Australian nationalist discourses of race have morphed into forms of enlightened racism has been a useful tool in drawing attention to the continuities that exist between past and present understandings of Indigenous people that inform the AFL and Australian football culture more broadly. And I might, since this is supposed to be an informal session, break from my written speech and just talk about some experiences of enlightened racism. Part of my research has taken me to the AFL's drive into the market of post-apartheid South Africa. And there are people on the ground in South Africa, in African townships, promoting Australian rules as the game of reconciliation based on the AFL's achievement over the last 15 years of increasing Indigenous participants in the game. In the Melbourne media, the message that we are fed constantly is that Indigenous people are substantially overrepresented in the game and that the league is a leader on Indigenous issues and reconciliation. However, the discourse of enlightened racism that I've just introduced limits the participation of Indigenous people in the game to on-field roles. And I would argue, as a bit of a cynic of what comes out in the Melbourne press, that Indigenous people in some ways are used in contemporary sport as an echo of colonial forms of performance. The human zoo syndrome, we might call it, where exotic performers are used as spectacle to be viewed and talked about and discussed by non-Indigenous people. So that's one area where we can point to enlightened racism working in Australian football. Enlightened racism doesn't mean that old forms of racism still don't exist, and outside of my role as an academic researcher caught up in discourses of enlightened racism and French philosophers like Foucault and Derrida, on Saturday mornings I recently became responsible for taking my 6-year-old son down to the local Auskick program, which is the AFL's national development program. And I was astounded to find that the sporting goods company that sponsors that program, which is attended by around 180,000 children throughout the country, is Ross Faulkner. And Ross Faulkner's footballs carry with them a brand called Native Brand, which is a stereotyped Aboriginal figure about to throw a boomerang. And I got thinking, can you imagine the National Football League in the United States in its football development program being sponsored by a sporting goods company that supplied nigger brand footballs? And this is 20th century Australia, and yet I believe, as a person of Indigenous descent, that those kind of trademarks that are carryovers from the 19th century must be sending certain messages to young people across Australia about the place of Indigenous people in society and in Australian football specifically. So I've probably spoken enough now, but there are many issues, and don't believe everything you hear about the AFL achieving reconciliation and the end of racism. There's a lot more work to be done. Thank you.
Look, I've come to this forum as an advisor to sports and individuals for many years, and as a sports participant myself and a spectator through my family, my large and sports-loving family. And I've also, in terms of my legal practice, been involved in a number of disciplinary tribunals involving significant ethnic violence and issues of racial discrimination and vilification, although not limited to Indigenous issues. I just want to make a few points. There have been, and everyone knows, there are well-documented examples of complaint resolution in this area with various levels of satisfaction over the last 10 or 15 years. And I also refer back to the Heriock report in 2007, which Graeme referred to. And I thought it's interesting that it suggests that while racist attitudes have remained strong in Australia over the last 10 years, there has been a considerable reduction in overt racist behaviour. And they suggest that it's due in part to the development of strong social norms against openly expressing racist views. And this report is centred on sport. It's not a general analysis of racism in Australia. Now, if you look at that as a finding, I guess you go back to the fact that the foundation in that change of views is probably the laws on racial discrimination and racial vilification, which started to be enacted in around the late 70s and during the 80s. And the law is a significant foundation to all of this. I was interested quite recently when I was advising on a grassroots sporting situation where racial vilification was involved, and there'd been some racial vilification and there were threats of violence on both sides. I had to remind the sporting organisation involved that, as well as issues relating to the safety of all of the participants, which the organisers were clearly very keen to ensure, that both sides to the incident ought to be reminded that they may very well have broken the law. And the law applies regardless of whether it occurs in sport. And sometimes in Australia, particularly in Australia, it's an issue I've had to deal with throughout my practice in sport. People think that because sport's involved, it's somehow different from other areas of trade and commerce or life generally, and of course it's not. The other thing I wanted to refer to was the Australian Sports Commission's member protection policy, and I was lucky enough to work on that. It contains prohibitions on racial discrimination and vilification, with reporting, mediation and disciplinary action as part of a member protection policy. And organisations are not funded by the Sports Commission unless they have adopted these policies down to grassroots level. So theoretically, there are some other things that can be done within the sport. Now, I also did a bit of polling and rang a few organisations and also some government authorities, and Graeme would have a better handle on all of this than I do. But evidence suggests that while there are some issues arising from time to time, there are not a real large number of complaints made under the member protection policies. So I think that the really important questions we need to explore are the following. What is the real scale of the problem, and how do we work out what the real scale of the problem is? Are the processes and procedures that have been implemented to date actually working? And the most important thing, I think, is, are aggrieved participants uncomfortable or intimidated about making complaints? And if that's the case, we need to do something to assist them. And that's all I wanted to say.
As you know, my name's Marcia Ella-Duncan. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners, the traditional custodians of the land. As chairperson of the La Perouse Local Aboriginal Land Council, whose boundaries take in the university, I would also like to say a special welcome on behalf. The board doesn't know that, but anyway, I'll tell them about it later. But I'm delighted to be at the ILC. I feel very strongly about the contribution that the ILC makes to Indigenous social justice issues more broadly, but I am particularly fond of the University of New South Wales, and I love coming here. So thank you, Megan, and thank you, Jeanette, for the invitation to be here. I have to say a quick hello to some familiar faces in the audience. Hi. And pay my respects to the tremendous brain power around me, and I feel so incredibly humbled. It's quite a privilege to be here. Tonight I want to talk to you on a very personal level. I have scribbled some notes about what I want to say, more as reminders about the conversation I'd like to hold. I first started playing netball, I think, when I was 9. I spent a lot of my early years watching my older sisters play netball. It was always just a very natural progression for me. Some of you may know that I played netball for Australia, but I also have 3 brothers that played rugby union for Australia. So, you know, participation in sport was my mother's way of managing 12 children. You know, it was a condition that any sport that you participated in was an organised sport. So we had to have good supervision, good transport, because Mum and Dad didn't own a car. And, you know, we had to be fully committed. And so there were some very important, very strong values instilled in us at a very young age about being committed, about, you know, putting in your best, about being a team player. But the most important message was to have fun and to stay out of trouble, of course. But as long as we're enjoying what we're doing, we could go on for as much as we like. And, you know, every single one of us in our family played at least 3, possibly 4 different sports every year. And of course, as we got older, we had to start dropping sports because we couldn't afford to keep playing them all. Sport has played an incredibly important role in my life, obviously, and it has in my brother's lives, but indeed my entire community. And anybody who's Aboriginal knows how important sport is. Sport is one of those arenas that apparently is a level playing field. It is an opportunity for us to pit our skills against the best. It is an opportunity for us to play the larrikin at the same time, while showcasing some of our incredible natural competitiveness and balance and coordination and speed. And in my personal experience, there is an abundance of those qualities in Aboriginal people. So the sporting field is really important to us. Sport has also become an incredibly powerful, culturally appropriate tool. It is an opportunity for our families, for our communities, for our race, indeed, together, and to celebrate resilience and survival, and to have fun, and to reconnect. And all of those things are terribly important. So for Aboriginal people, sport is different than what it is to a lot of other Australians. When I was, in fact, at the Australian Institute of Sport, which had an incredibly rigorous training regime, as you could imagine, training twice a day, playing a couple of times a week, having sessions with nutritionists and with psychologists and with therapists and with, you name it. We had sessions with them, some fantastic masseurs, but in any case. I forgot what I was going to say. When we were at the Australian Institute of Sport, it became really apparent to me. Obviously, I was the first Aboriginal person to hold a scholarship, an institute scholarship. And it became incredibly apparent to me that sport was really different to other people than what it was to me. And I don't think I'm an exception. There were people who, despite our couple of training sessions a week, would do additional running sessions at lunchtime and spend an extra 20 minutes in the weight room and go on a brown rice diet for 2 weeks, and all of these really bizarre behaviours to improve their performance. And the bottom line for me was, wow, that's just not fun. It's just not fun. And although I was as competitive and worked as hard, I never thought that sport would overwhelm the other important things in my life, like family and community and having a decent job and, having a good, strong social network. And so it was very apparent in those days. I did experience racism, but some very interesting and subtle forms of racism. I know that one example that I want to share with you, I only became aware of a couple of years ago, in fact, when I was a young girl and eligible to be trialling for state, netball teams, state public school netball teams and CHS teams. And I had a wonderful coach at that time. Her name is Marcia Kelly. You probably know Murray. She's one of the old girls out at Randwick that you see all the time. And, Murray would make sure that I got to all of these trials. And I was never selected in a state team until I was 15, in fact, nearly 16. And that was never a problem to me because I just didn't get picked because I wasn't good enough, and that's all right because I was having more fun at home. So it was never a problem for me. I became aware just a couple of years ago, in fact, when Marcia Kelly had her retirement dinner. Marcia Kelly was a teacher. She taught me at La Perouse School. And Mari talked about how when I was a young girl and she would take me along to these trials, and Mari was astounded that I never got selected because in her view, and I quote, I wouldn't say this myself, but I was the best player on the court. And it was so unacceptable to Mari because she judged that the only reason I wasn't getting selected was because I was Aboriginal. And of course I was always the only Aboriginal at trials. I know now that that's the reason why Mari got involved in the New South Wales Public Schools Sports Association, which is the state level sports administration for public schools. Mari went on to have a phenomenal 35 years as a sports administrator and selector from those very humble beginnings. But it was the first time I heard somebody actually say to me that those selection outcomes were racist. I always thought I just wasn't good enough. Another form of racism that I experienced was when I played in the New South Wales netball team. Again, the only Aboriginal person there. And, you know, I always thought, even training when we're working our butts off can be fun. And so I would often act the larrikin and have a little bit of fun, and we'd all be working hard and having a good laugh. And whenever we would laugh, the coach would turn around and say, oh, you know, there she is, that lazy Ella, you know, she never works hard, all she's doing is mucking around having fun. And she failed to see the sweat, blood and tears pouring out of me, but was just quite happy to write off my sense of fun as, you know, just being lazy. My parents never owned a vehicle. I had to catch public transport to all of my training sessions if I couldn't organise a ride. And so from time to time I would turn up to training late, and it was because I was going walkabout. And you know, it came to the crunch towards the end of my netball career where, you know, I was risking missing Australian selection because I wasn't getting enough court time. And I found out years later that the captain and the vice captain had actually taken on the coach over my selection in the starting 7 because they found that it was unacceptable that I was sitting on the bench. And you know, that was again, you know, a number of years later, it was that I found out that, you know, it was definitely a form of racism that was preventing my progression through the Australian team. I did talk about what I thought was racism to my colleagues. I'd say, you know what, I really don't like the way she talks about me going walkabout. And, you know, if she had to catch a bus from La Perouse and a train to Auburn and, you know, be there at 7 o'clock in the morning, she might find it a bit hard to get here on time too. And I was often told, oh no, that can't be the case, because you know what, she's a good Christian woman. And I thought, yeah, you know what the church did to Aboriginal people. Many hours were spent talking with my netball colleagues about what it meant to be Aboriginal. They had no concept of land rights. They had no concept of disadvantage. They had no concept of, you know, having to be reared on mullet and homegrown vegetables because we never had money to buy anything else. And so I thought, and I do believe, that I in fact brought about a process of change with my colleagues just through conversations. And at the end of my netball career, I felt so strongly about those conversations that I thought I'm going to continue them. And went on to work in Aboriginal affairs and have done some quite remarkable things, particularly around Aboriginal child sexual assault. But more importantly than that, I take those valuable lessons and learnings into my everyday life. I have been coaching and playing netball for nearly 40 years actually. Oh, shame job. And you know, a couple of years ago, about 5 years ago in fact, I set up my own netball club because when I came back to Sydney after a time 10 years away from Sydney, I started playing with a local Aboriginal club and could not tolerate the racist attitudes that were prevalent in my netball club. But they were racist attitudes from my own mob towards non-Aboriginal people. And, you know, it was a stark reminder that racism exists in all of our communities and that regardless of where it exists, we do have a responsibility to take it on. And so consequently, I left my home club, which was a very big decision for me. My mother was a founder of that club, and set up my own club. And it's, you know, we're promoted as a tolerant, family-friendly club, mainly because you've got my family playing in it, and you have to be tolerant to put up with them. But we do promote those principles about tolerance and acceptance, and, you know, sport is not just a way to make friends, but it can be an important vehicle to achieve social justice. And besides that, everybody deserves a chance to have a go. And I truly believe that we've got some tremendous champions in my community, and I intend to find them and grow them up. So, you know, our club has done some fairly phenomenal things. That we've had a number of racial incidences that we've had to deal with. We've dealt with them very firmly. And in fact, some of the other clubs in our association have started to adopt the practice that we have in dealing with racism. I've recently completed the member protection officer training, including completing the Play by the Rules online training, and we will be making it compulsory in our club for any club official any person to be made a club official in my club has to complete the online Play by the Rules training. Our club is only a young club. We've got 14 teams. About 50% are Aboriginal. About 20% are Islander, because us coloured girls like to stick together. And about 30% are non-Aboriginal. But people join our club not just because we have a lot of Aboriginal people there, but people have a strong sense of fairness and a strong sense of justice. And they know that when they come to play with us, their kids are going to get a fair go and they're going to be treated with respect. And I think that above anything else is more important than winning games, sometimes. But it certainly is a really important building block for developing children. And I know from first-hand experience that, sport can not only, of course, earn you money now, but it can open a whole world that for a lot of Aboriginal kids is otherwise unattainable. Stamping out racism in sport is an incredibly important responsibility that we all carry, and it doesn't matter where that racism is, we have to deal with it. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Dominic Fitzsimmons. I was a student at this university and now teach here. My question is about the issue of sledging, because it seems to me that one of the aspects where racism is important in sport is sledging. And is it that what we're trying to say here is that we're changing what sledging is by saying, well, these things are okay to sledge on, like, that something about your mother, for example, which still seems to be a really important aspect in a lot of male sports, but then there are other aspects which it's not okay to sledge about. Are we kind of setting the rules there in terms of how the game is being played? I suppose this is a question for each of the panellists.
Is there anyone particularly that would like to answer that question first, or address it and then pass it on to someone else?
I can
Thanks.
at least
Thank you,
give
Dave.
the perspective from rugby league's point of view, which is that it is a difficult issue because it's often suggested that the racist sledge was a response to a non-racist sledge. For instance, we had an example a number of years ago where the whole episode commenced with someone being called a fat so-and-so, which led to the retort, well, you're a black so-and-so. And they felt that was justified on the basis that they'd been called fat. It is a difficult issue when you're trying to educate young players about the differences, and I don't suggest that we've got that right. I think the challenge, perhaps, as Deb said, one of the big challenges is giving the victims of these situations the confidence to come forward. And one of the lessons that I think we've taken out of the Timana Tahu, Andrew Johns situation is we need to actually make it easier for those that are aggrieved to come forward and not operate a process where, unless they're prepared to come forward, no action will be taken. We had a situation last year where we fined a player, Cronulla Sharks player, for using a racist remark on the field. The victim of that was very reluctant to come forward about it. He felt that an apology had been issued to him within 24 hours, and that sort of what happens on the field stays on the field attitude is hard to break down. We ended up taking action against that player anyway, even though the victim wasn't prepared to go forward with his complaint. And I think that's part of the challenge here, is to give the aggrieved party's confidence. One of my big takeouts of the Timana Tahu situation when I sat down and listened to him was I had no appreciation of just how many years he had been through holding his tongue about these types of issues and not taking action. It got to an acute point in that Origin camp, but it was clear that there had been many, many other occasions where he had been offended. I'm not sure if I've completely answered your question about the difference between sledges, but...
I might make a comment. I think there's a clear difference in terms of sledging. Vilifying someone on the basis of their race or their disability, or they're probably the two key ones here, is against the law. Vilifying someone, unless it relates to their disability because of their weight or whether they're quick or slow, or something to do with their mother, which does seem to be popular. I've never understood why, but is not against the law. There's a clear difference.
I don't think, Graeme, anyone's suggesting there isn't a difference.
No, but
it's about educating people about that difference.
Yeah, and that's what we need to do, and that's what the codes need to do at all levels in the codes, and both players and officials, and things like the Play by the Rules site that been referred to a couple of times tonight does that. I thought the question related to the difference, David. That's what I was responding to. But
oh no, I was just being careful to get the message out that the difference is clear.
I know,
it's
okay.
the education around the difference which is often hard for young footballers to understand.
Yeah.
The difference between a black C and a fat C, as I said in our situation, this young guy couldn't see the difference.
Yeah, understand your point. But as I said, I thought that was what the question was about, and so yeah, I think that there's no doubt there is a difference, and we need to address that, because of course, if people don't see that difference in sport, then they don't see it in the rest of life, and we as a society need to be much more active about challenging. Well, for tonight's topic, racism, but any vilification on a basis that that is unlawful.
I think it's good to talk about positive things that can be done. I was particularly interested in what David was talking about the campaigns which the Rugby League have tried to encourage. I was just thinking when we're hearing this about the way that my game, which is English football, has changed over since the time when I used to watch football in England 20 years ago. It's not perfect now, but it's very, very different from the way it used to be, and it's very different from what you get if you look at what's happening in some European football grounds, particularly in Spain and Italy. And I think what happened particularly was that racism was tackled by some popular movements in England in the 70s and 80s, movements like the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism and so on, so that it became actually uncool to be racist on the terraces, that it empowered people to, if somebody was standing next to you said a racist comment about somebody on the field, that in the past people would have just, you'd kept quiet. It empowered people to do something about it and object. And I remember seeing that happening in English football grounds in the 1980s, where ordinary blokes would turn to the person who'd said it and say, get out or whatever. And so I'd be interested to hear particularly from David, what sort of things to say a bit more about what the Rugby League is doing to encourage that. I mean, I don't mean things like broad cultural campaigns like that, but the sort of things which would make Andrew Johns in the changing room think twice before saying the kind of stuff he said.
Yeah, the whole British football experience is really interesting and probably blends into what Barry talked about. I mean, I think if you think about shows like Love Thy Neighbour now, It's just extraordinary to think that that was popular television. And I loved sitting here listening to Barry talk about where the AFL are getting it wrong. Could have sat here for hours. But I think, I guess one of the things that we've done, and it's across a range of issues, whether it's abusing alcohol, gambling, so-called recreational drug use, we've tried to get cultural awareness courses as part of all of those programs and get to our players at a younger and younger age. Those sorts of programs were often being run at football clubs with 23, 24-year-olds, and lifestyle choices and indeed racist attitudes had probably already been adopted. We now run cultural awareness courses for players that are 17, 18, even younger, and we run those types of courses around alcohol and the other issues that are social pitfalls for footballers as well. So a great example, although not necessarily in the Indigenous space, last year Nigel Wagner, who's an ex-player, Samoan guy, decided to bring in some of our Samoan players and put them through a course about their own culture. And he said to me, if we can make them confident about where they come from, then they will go back out into football clubs and become leaders in a broader sense. He put in place this course on a 6-week, one night a week basis, and at the end of the 6 weeks, these Samoan guys asked to effectively do it again. And so it became a 12-week course because they'd had such a great experience of learning about their culture. And we do similar things with Indigenous kids, but I think for us, trying to get in early before young guys become part of a team which may have players from 17 years of age to 32, 33 years of age, and all of the entrenched attitudes that come with that kind of range of age groups. Success perhaps that we're having, and I'm not suggesting only in this space, but I am suggesting that if you can get guys to adopt appropriate choices early in their football careers, then you're a better chance of having some success.
I completely agree with David. I mean, I think that sport, along with other areas of Australian society, has a major challenge because there isn't nearly enough in our education curriculum about these sorts of issues, about human rights issues. And that's why I started where I did with my comments about the Charter of Rights consultation last year. We don't, as a country, provide a good enough understanding of rights and responsibilities to members of our community, and we need to change that. And that is part of the problem that sport has to, deals with the consequence of that.
I think if I could just make a comment, I think it's interesting that we talk about racism and other problems in sport in not so much a negative way, but we're talking about it as combating those problems within the sport. And I worry sometimes that we overlook the phenomenal opportunity that sport presents to the rest of the Australian community. Given how sports mad we are and how much media attention sports attracts in this country, it's a wonderful opportunity to breed strong leadership around some of those issues about responsible behaviour, about treating people with respect and about expecting to be treated with respect. And that's, I think that's a really important point to note, that in a way sports can lead the way. And I think we've seen some wonderful examples of that. I think what the NRL is doing is wonderful, and similarly with the member protection officer training, there are some fantastic resources and some great examples. And, it's not just sport, but it's other sectors of our community that we could really take a look at some of the things that sport does to deal with these behaviours.
We've just got to get the Sam Newmans of the world off television. That's.
Would you like to add a comment?
Yes, I'd like to add a comment building on what Marcia said, that as a non-Indigenous Australian and a product of the education system which fulfilled a whole range of stereotypes about the Indigenous community. The place where I met most of my Indigenous friends, and I know that that's originally where my family's met most of our Indigenous friends, is through playing sport in the local area. And it's incredibly important from that point of view that sport is a race, doesn't have those racist overtones, but just at a base level, it's just a great place for everyone to meet and mix if they're there.
Hi, I'm Darryl Adair from UTS. I've got a question for Barry and also David. You can respond in respect of your particular sporting interests. And it comes back to something that Barry raised a little while ago, and that is the importance of providing opportunities for Indigenous people to have employment in sport. And that doesn't mean playing necessarily. That means opportunities to be in the media, to be in administrative roles, to perhaps be in coaching support roles, whatever it is. I understand, Barry, that the AFL's got a program whereby they're wanting to establish, I think it's something like 2% of their workforce to be Aboriginal outside of the playing arena. Maybe you can comment on that. And I wonder, David, if the NRL has any thoughts in mind about increasing perhaps the proportion of Aboriginal and maybe even Islander staff within the administration of the sport.
Can I start? I'd better dig myself out of the hole, at least partially. I might get turned back at the border if I keep on going the way I have. Just to, contextualise what I've been saying a little bit, a key criticism of the AFL would be a key criticism that I have of all or a lot of Australian institutions, and that is Australian institutions, whether they be universities, schools or sporting institutions like the AFL, have historically lacked Indigenous people. And so these institutions don't really know how to deal and to relate to Indigenous people. And so I haven't been saying that there isn't a lot of goodwill and opportunity within the AFL. One of the most fantastic days of my life was being in South Africa at Sun City, this icon of apartheid-era politics, and being invited to Kevin Sheedy's breakfast table to talk about things. And Kevin Sheedy, as you may know, is kind of an icon of Australian football in terms of the man who really pushed things for Indigenous people in the game and opened up a lot of doors. A mentor of Michael Long and a key mover behind the anti-vilification laws that were introduced in 1995. And Sheedy's pretty practical. He thinks university people are wankers, fair enough. So we had this kind of difficult conversation over breakfast because I was there as a researcher. And I said, Kevin, so why is it that you came to support things like Dreamtime at the G and reconciliation? And he said, well, doesn't my name tell you anything? Sheedy, it's from Ireland. The Irish had the shit kicked out of them by the English for hundreds of years. Indigenous people are just the same. And that's what brought me to work with Indigenous people. Now, that's a fairly basic understanding, which I took to mean that Kevin Sheedy learned to work and negotiate through Indigenous issues from a base that was pretty low. There was some kind of connection there from his own background that brought him into the field, but he's had to work to get there. And I think the institution, the AFL, a university like this, has to do the same thing. But they're trying, and they tried during a decade when I think the Howard government didn't try very hard, and we have to give them a big tick for that. And they continue to try. 11% of playing personnel is the thing that the AFL rides its kind of credentials on. However, where rugby league has it over the AFL, I think in many respects, is the move from playing personnel into those off-field roles, both in the game and in the media. I think the rugby league could make a lot more or get a lot more mileage out of where it's achieved in those respects, where the AFL is just now thinking about it. And I think you're right, they're just introducing a employment package now to get that up and running. It's a huge lack in the game, and I guess the lack, and I would see it as an institutional form of racism, is a huge negative in the context of Australian football, because it allows characters like Sam Newman to get away with the crap that they continually get away with on TV.
Part of our Reconciliation Action Plan and part of the work that our Indigenous Council is doing is looking for opportunities for people to transition into administrative positions. Ricky Walford has been at the league for a number of years now, and he does an enormous amount of work. I mentioned Nigel Wagner's only been on the staff for a couple of years. But I think one of the key roles that our Indigenous players have played in recent times is promoting a message to Indigenous kids to get educated, because they look at Greg Inglis and Jonathan Thurston and think, well, I'll just become a professional footballer, and it's really important that that message is pumped home by Indigenous superstars of our game.
Tony Hughes, I'm here from University of New South Wales, and I teach 4 of the sport law courses here, 2 of which are international based and 2 of which are Australian based, and obviously all have race involved somewhere or other in them. And I've probably got about 47 questions, but we've only got 30 minutes, so we'll keep it short. I think one of the most important things that was said tonight was by my colleague Deborah Healy, where she said that there's this sort of notion that goes around, and I could tackle David on a number of other issues, but I won't, where sport thinks it's different than everywhere else, and it's not. And I think sport has to wake up to itself, and it is not different. It is the same before the law and in society as every other thing. But I think one of the most important things is that we've got to realise, because of that sport, it's all about the vernacular in Australian society. Now, you mentioned about being Irish, okay? I'm an Irish immigrant, not Australian. I'm not an Australian citizen. I immigrated here when I was 13 and a half with my family, and I went to a Catholic school in the Blue Mountains, and we had a beautiful Indigenous girl in our form. Her name was Alice, but she was nicknamed Bung. Okay? And we were told by Sister Anne that Aboriginal Australians were going to be the only race that will ever die out. That's what we were told. So that was my introduction to Indigenous Australia. But then there were a number of boys' homes, Clairvaux, Waruna, which I guess were young boys who'd been taken away from their families, and we used to play soccer against them on the weekend. And they were, tremendous sportsmen. If I can fast forward to last night, when we got the result of the election, I'm on the board of a local bowling club, and went down there last night for the post-Gallard victory, talks, and we have quite a range of people involved in that club, but mostly, retired or elderly guys, and sort of blokes from their 50s up. And again, I think it's all about the vernacular, because the words bung, coon, wog, spick, abo are constantly used every night of the week. Every night of the week. And I think this is something that Australians just won't face up to. And because it's part of the vernacular, you can't expect young guys who grow up in, who leave school, to pursue a professional football career and grow up without the middle class education a lot of us have had, not to pick this stuff up. And until we eliminate this stuff from our society, it's never going to go away. In my courses, I use a film called Australian Rules, which some of you may have seen. It was made in 2000 from a book a friend of mine wrote, Philip Gwynn, called Deadly Anna. And he was an Australian Rules footballer until he busted his knee down in the peninsula in South Australia, and it deals with sport in an Australian rules football club at the grassroots level. And I think it's fantastic that, you know, the AFL, and after Nicky Winmar, Michael Long introduced their racial vilification rule, and the rugby league and everybody else has followed up on that. It's one thing doing that at the elite level, but how do you combat it at the local level? You know, this is a bigger problem, and it's all very well to say here, you know, that your admirable policies at the elite level are dealing with this stuff, but it's a really, really deep problem, and sport is not different, it's not separate, and it's something that we have to attack in a whole different way. And until if you can go to a bowling club in the eastern suburbs and you're still hearing that stuff coming out, you know, and I played soccer at state league level, and we got it there between ethnicities. You know, I got it when I was at school. You're a rep, because I was Irish, you're a refo, and so on. You're a rock cake. All of that. I worked on building sites when I was doing my PhD. Almost every dispute that happened on building sites, because there's lots of different ethnic groups on building sites, came down to race. And unless we eliminate this stuff at that level and really make it public and wake up to it, I don't think we're going to get anywhere with this. Sorry. Didn't mean to give a lecture.
I think Graeme might want to answer that one.
Well, I place a lot of the blame with our political leaders. I mean, we haven't had a multicultural policy in Australia and an anti-racism strategy for 10 to 15 years. And we have political leaders, and I'm talking about political leaders on both sides of politics, who make these statements about Australia has zero tolerance to racism. But when you go below the surface, that's actually not supported by the statements that are made. You only have to look at the race to the bottom that we saw in the recent election on asylum seekers, and don't tell me that there isn't a racist part in that issue. So until we get some much stronger political leadership, until we get an appropriate and appropriately resourced multicultural strategy and anti-racism strategy, we're actually selling ourselves short. And the diverse society that we have the fabric of that society is being damaged by not addressing this issue. You're absolutely right.
David Brown, University of New South Wales. I'd just like to ask David Gallop if he could take something that he's already said just a little bit further, and that is, I think one of the many barriers is exactly that attitude you mentioned, that what goes on the field stays on the field. Certainly that was the position that Paul Gallen took after racially sledging Mickey Paya. And it was good, I think, that the NRL went ahead and took action, albeit that Mickey Paya wasn't that keen on it being taken any further. But I wonder what other steps could be taken to try to undermine that cultural value that what goes on in the field stays on the field, because it is quite widespread amongst players, amongst spectators, and it seems to me there needs to be some other action or maybe something integrated into the rules of the game or into the responsibilities of officials and so on to take action, you know, on the spot, in a sense, against racial sledging.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the answer to it. One of the answers is to make sure that you're not just reliant on there being a victim, and I think we're moving that way. Our initial anti-vilification policies were all about, unless there's a complaint made, then we won't act, and we've moved away from that. And that attitude of what happens on the field stays on the field, I should add, isn't just about this issue. In the last few weeks, we've had a biting issue where the victim wasn't prepared to give evidence at the judiciary. Irrespective of that, the player was charged and ultimately found there wasn't enough evidence of a bite. So it just doesn't affect this issue. I think it's an education about, it's educating non-Indigenous people about what it's like to be in that position. And that's got to be the core of what we're trying to achieve. The only personal experience I can sort of give of that is when the Timana Tahu issue happened. I got a 17-year-old who to play representative sport, he couldn't understand that someone would give up that opportunity. Coincidentally, he had just inherited my myopia and was about to attend his first day at school wearing glasses. For those of you who wear glasses, you'd remember it well, a day when you feel so self-conscious. But I said to him, you're going to feel self-conscious for about 24 hours and then it's going to be over. But imagine if every step of your life, every new room that you went into, you were at risk of feeling self-conscious like that. And it was about the colour of your skin. How bad would that be? And I think it sort of sheeted home to him how it would be. I love Preston Campbell's comment around the All-Stars game when he really simply just said it when he said, it's about being proud of who you are and where you come from. And that's the kind of education that you need to instill, and it might break down that what happens on the field stays on the field.
Thank you very much.
I think that's a really important point that David makes as well, that we've talked a lot about educating people about behaving in a way that is good for others and respecting each other's differences, but there's a large responsibility as well to help particularly young people know how to deal with these issues when they're arising in their lives. I know a lot of Aboriginal kids and they're called names and it's on, we're going to go out there, we're going to get done, and they can't do that, they can't get away with that. And I have to spend a lot of time talking to them about, it's wrong, but how else can we deal with that? And making kids or helping them to develop a self-image that is strong, that is proud, and that can withstand some of that. And I think importantly, the third element, of course, is making sure that our processes for dealing with them are accessible, that people know clearly what their rights are and how to protect them and, how to not just defend themselves and make them, build some inner strength and resilience, but it's also really about helping people to understand what are the things that they can do to address that in a more formal way.
Thank you. I have another question. I'm just going to pass the mic over to the young lady.
Hi, I'm an art student here at UNSW. Is racism a common denominator in both women and men's sports, or is it prevalent in one more than another? 21.
I don't have any stats on that, so I can't answer it from that sense. I mean, our complaint numbers aren't big enough to tell us that. I don't know whether participants are in a better position than I am to comment, or previous participants, but I can't answer your question.
I think if I could speak from a women's sport perspective, I think if you came to our local park on a Saturday and observed and took notice of the complaints that were coming in, you'd find that it's as prevalent in women's sport as it is in men's sport. I think one of the differences in perception around that, possibly to do with the media, is that we have such an emphasis in this country on men's sport, and so issues of racism and other undesirable behaviour tend to attract an awful lot of media attention, and women's sport just doesn't get in the papers to start with. So I think there's that element. I think also in men's sport, sledging is far more prevalent. Oh goodness, we don't sledge in netball or basketball. We're far too polite for that. But I think it is quite different in men's sport, and I think that has to do with how much physical effort is being put in, and sometimes how much money is involved. Like you're getting paid an awful lot of money to perform, and so you are very emotional. And there are times when you may say things that you would not otherwise say, or there's times too where your guard drops and you let the cat out of the bag. But and I think that has to do in part with a number of characteristic differences between men and women's sport. But I would suggest, from my experience, I think racism in sport is just as prevalent in female sport as it is in men's. And I think it's just as prevalent in kids' sport, unfortunately, as it is in adult or professional sports.
Hi, I'm Claire Harvey from the Sunday Telegraph. I just wanted to ask Barry and Marcia, actually, to talk about the question of the idealisation of Indigenous people's physical attributes and love of sport. You both touched on that. And Barry, I kind of got the impression that you were saying that that was something which the AFL clapped itself on the back about and played up to. But Marcia seemed to be expressing a real joy and a real belief that there was an athleticism and a special relationship with sport. So I was interested to hear a bit more about that.
I think from my perspective, it's not, I guess, we're not talking about recruiting Aboriginal netball players because they have particularly long arms. I mean, some people say I've got long arms, but I know lots of brilliant Aboriginal netballers that have quite short arms. Similarly with, other physical attributes, it's not necessarily about, whether you're a certain height or you're a certain width or you have other physical characteristics. But for me, it's the combination of that. And there are some things about Aboriginal culture that I think lend itself to sport. Our, worldview that is very external and is very focused on our community, I think lends itself well to be able to work in teams. I think our resilience and our ability to use humour to overcome adversity, which, anybody in an Aboriginal family knows that we are so good at laughing at ourselves. And I think we take that onto the sporting field, that we get a joy out of being able to work well with the people around us, to be able to excel. We do have a natural competitiveness. God, you should see dinner time at my family table. It was just horrendous. But, that we do have certain characteristics, I think, that lend itself well to a competitive environment. And I think because sport has been one of those vehicles to bring a certain level of justice and equity to our people, it's become a very dear and very important vehicle. And I think what Barry was talking about in terms of, some of the stereotypes around, because we're hunters and gatherers, sorry, I just seen me running around trying to hunt a kangaroo. It's just hilarious. But by jinkos, I can hunt fish. I think that's outdated and inaccurate. There are certainly qualities about us that lend itself well to sport, but it's not necessarily ones that are because, we're still running around the back of the desert with a spear and a boomerang, basically.
I think the point I was trying to make is the point that Adam Goodes makes in the official history, and that is to be an Indigenous footballer is to be stereotyped. And he confirms much of what I say in my research by saying that AFL recruiters stereotype Indigenous players in certain ways and seek to recruit players for certain types of positions, and they are usually the fast attacking reactive positions forward of centre. They're not centre half back, who is becoming increasingly like the quarterback in American football. So there are kind of stereotypes, I would say, that give preference to physical characteristics that are incorrectly, I think, seen as racial attributes over other attributes like intelligence. So we need to ask ourselves, and this goes, I guess, to why is it that Indigenous people seem to be contained to on-field roles? Why aren't they being encouraged to be coaches or administrators or indeed CEOs of these sporting organisations? And I think we need to go make the link back from elite sports and look at local or regional sporting contexts where we have Australian football clubs, very successful ones, that are based in Indigenous communities, run by those communities. Why is the AFL so scared then to imagine or put on the agenda the possibility of an Indigenous community-led franchise? Not an Indigenous exclusive franchise, but one that's controlled by Indigenous people that then recruits non-Indigenous players and officials. That's something that they just can't imagine at the moment.
think Adam Goods articulated all of that really well just in the last few months in an article I read in the Telegraph when he talked about the fact that Indigenous athletes get stereotyped as just natural ability, and he made the point, he sort of wrote down what a week in training for the Swans involved, Indigenous or non-Indigenous. They're all doing the hard yards, running around the park and lifting weights, and I know you've got better access to the Telegraph library than the rest of us, Claire. You can probably find it, but I thought he articulated it really well.
I might add to that, I spent some time a while back researching Sid Jackson's background, and Sid was a member of the Stolen Generations in Western Australia. And he said that one of the few opportunities that kids on the mission, and probably throughout Western Australia through the 50s and 60s and maybe into the 70s were given were footballs. And so there's a cultural and broader political reason why Indigenous people were channelled into football or netball or athletics and not into becoming a lawyer or a doctor or a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. But all those things are kind of forgotten in these discourses about sport.
Marcia, I just wanted to make a quick comment about something you mentioned about the motivation behind you establishing your own club, and that was racism, but from within your own team, from your own mob towards white people. And I thought that was a really interesting comment or observation that you made, because I noticed during the Timana Tahu controversy that a prominent Aboriginal sports person, a former NRL player who I believe is now a boxer, made a racist comment about two Aboriginal former players. And I just noticed in the media it was never picked up on that he had used a racist term to describe fellow Aboriginal former NRL players in amongst this whole discourse around racism. I just found it incredible that he would use that language publicly. And that it would be printed and not really raised, particularly even by our people, as being completely inappropriate to use that language. So I just thought that was an interesting point you raised, because I think that is a big challenge in our own communities. We've noticed an increase in that kind of racism towards non-Indigenous Australians, and it's certainly something that we too need to combat. And particularly in our sporting teams.
I think that's a really good point. You know, if the same comments were said by a non-Aboriginal person, they would have made the front page, and it would have been a week-long story. You know, I think it's really important for the Aboriginal community as well to front up to its own issues. And I think that's an important part of the evolution of, you know, equity for Aboriginal people in this country. It does take more than one party or one half to make a difference, and you know, I think it will take a tremendous amount of courage on the Aboriginal community's part to front up to the areas that it needs to improve its gaming. And so I took a very strong stand against that. I think it's really important that we show consistent leadership around some of these issues, and I made a stand. And you know, we're running a successful club now. The club that I left has virtually wound up, and I'm not surprised, because they're not going to keep people if you're only a certain type of person can play. You know, mark my words, I work really hard with young Aboriginal girls. I have very personal reasons for wanting to see young Aboriginal girls succeed and develop to their full potential. And I make no bones about that in my club, that, you know, we will drop our fees for kids that are having financial difficulty. A lot of times I'm personally sponsoring people. I encourage families to play, because, you know, it's a bit hard. You know, it costs about $200 minimum to register a child at netball, and most of our families are quite big. So it can be quite a burden for families. So, you know, there are times when we waive our fees completely, pick kids up, bend our training times. We do whatever's necessary. But we don't tolerate racism in any way, shape or form.
I think that is the last question for the evening. I would like to thank everyone for being here tonight. I'm asking Laura to come up and hand to each of our panel members a small gift from the ILC and the faculty to thank them for coming along this evening. It was an absolute pleasure, so I'd just like everyone to give a warm thank you.